In the center of the 20th century, the European continent was trapped in a total war that exceeded any previous calculation. Germany, which had started the conflict with confidence in its rapid attack methods, soon became obligated to sustain a struggle much longer than its leaders had imagined. The campaign stretched out, and the army was subjected to a pace it could not maintain. Millions of men were mobilized and sent to battles that multiplied without respite, with commands that continued to demand sacrifices even when defeat was evident. The military machinery was consumed in endless marches and in confrontations where individual survival barely had space. The civilian population was also dragged into an unprecedented effort, while the political leadership insisted on maintaining the war until the last day. The result was a human cost of dimensions difficult to grasp. What exactly was it that provoked so many deaths, and why did almost everyone disappear? Blitzkrieg, the illusion that killed thousands. When the German army crossed the borders of Poland in September of 1939, many high commanders still did not know that they were starting a war that would break all previous structures. The offensive was presented as a perfect example of speed, precision, and modernity. But in reality, it lacked solid planning and clear manuals to guide the operations. Decisions were made on the fly, and they worked because the enemy collapsed quickly, not because of a long-term developed strategy. In the first days, the German commanders noticed that the Poles could not sustain fixed positions, and that gave the impression that mobility was the definitive key to success. The armored columns advanced at great speed, while the aviation destroyed routes, depots, and communications. However, behind that image of power, the officers knew that the logistical apparatus was not prepared for a prolonged war. In reality, the offensive against Poland was a rehearsal that turned out better than expected, because the enemy was poorly equipped and poorly distributed. As the days passed, the German High Command began to see that victory as a model. The result was that when the order to invade France arrived, a solid campaign was not designed, but a hurried copy of what had been done a few weeks earlier. The armored divisions received more prominence, although there was no clear doctrine about their long-term use. The attack on the west began in May of 1940. The armored units advanced through the Ardennes, an area that the French believed inaccessible to mechanized forces. The surprise was total. In a few days, the tanks crossed the Meuse River, broke the enemy defense, and advanced without waiting for the bulk of the infantry. That decision was made on the fly, without coordination or logistical foresight. The field commanders made tactical decisions that became strategic operations without anyone in Berlin planning it. At that moment, the German press began to use the term blitzkrieg as if it were a defined theory. In reality, it was a journalistic invention that sought to give a catchy name to an unexpected victory. Many generals, far from accepting that label, criticized the constant improvisation and the absence of real preparation. The armored units frequently ran out of fuel, lacked air cover, and were without logistical support, but the enemy crumbled so quickly that these shortcomings went unnoticed. As the advances accelerated, the structural problems were ignored. There was talk of a new type of warfare based on speed without defined fronts, but the truth is that the army did not have manuals or schools to support such a concept. Each commander improvised according to the situation. In France, luck again favored the attackers. The French command took days to react, and by the time it tried to counterattack, communications were already cut. The German divisions advanced without general coordination, but they encountered little or no resistance. The fall of France in 6 weeks was interpreted by many as proof that the model was infallible. In reality, it was the result of risky decisions made under pressure, which only worked because the enemy made even greater mistakes. The supply lines were too long, and vehicles were often lost due to lack of fuel. On several occasions, the tank commanders decided to stop because they had no ammunition or orders. Even so, the successes were so rapid that Hitler and the High Command believed they had discovered a definitive formula. That belief became an unsubstantiated doctrine. The logistical structures were not adjusted, nor was the communication system modernized. It was assumed that the next campaigns would follow the same pattern. The army was reorganized to repeat what had gone well, not to prepare for different scenarios. The priority of heavy artillery was reduced, and more power was given to the mobile units, although these often operated without coordination with the infantry. The campaign against France left a false image of invincibility. Internal recordings show that several generals warned about the risks of relying on speed without securing the supply, but those voices were ignored. It was believed that success lay in the initial impetus, in disorganizing the enemy in the first days, and that everything would be resolved by itself afterward. This mentality became the norm. Reserves were not strengthened, nor were resources stored for long campaigns. The army's structure was molded to repeat a formula that had only worked because of the exceptional conditions of the moment. When the operation in the West ended, many officers knew they could not sustain that pace if they faced an enemy that resisted longer. However, the myth of the blitzkrieg was already established. It was taught in academies as if it were a consolidated model, even though in reality it was never planned. The mistakes were covered up, and the critical reports were archived. In the weeks following the victory, Hitler made strategic decisions believing that all future wars would follow the same pattern. This directly affected the preparation for Operation Barbarossa. Instead of strengthening the supply lines, the mobile units were reinforced. Instead of designing plans for the winter, a rapid victory was planned. Everything was based on the illusion that a new lightning war could disintegrate any resistance. But the case of Poland and France would not be repeated. The Soviets would not collapse in weeks, nor would they allow an advance without a response. The German army arrived in 1941 without a structure ready for the duration, the climate, or the depth of the Eastern Front. The decisions made after the initial campaigns transformed an improvisation into a norm. That illusion led to thousands of soldiers penetrating beyond logistical limits without any preparation to face the paralysis, and with an operational organization built upon a model that never actually existed. The tyranny of the high command when surrender was forbidden. From the beginning of the invasion of the Soviet Union, the orders arriving from the German regime's leadership made it clear that retreating was not an option. As the months advanced, that slogan was transformed into an iron rule that prohibited any voluntary withdrawal. In every corner of the Eastern Front, middle-ranking commanders received direct instructions to hold firm, regardless of the terrain conditions, the number of casualties, or the lack of supplies, and that line was maintained until the end. What started as a measure of pressure to gain time became an obligation imposed at all levels, where any doubt about resistance was harshly punished. The first signs of this approach appeared in the initial clashes on Soviet soil, when the enemy counteroffensive managed to isolate several German units. Instead of allowing them to withdraw to regroup, they were ordered to remain in their positions, surrounded and without reinforcements. These types of decisions were repeated over and over, even when the high command knew that the result was the destruction of entire divisions. The official discourse insisted that all withdrawal amounted to treason, and under that premise, dozens of officers who tried to save their men from a certain massacre were executed. The resistance to any withdrawal intensified when it became clear that the war would not be quick. Instead of modifying the strategy, Hitler reinforced his personal vision of the conflict as a struggle of will, where the important thing was not the position on the map, but the capacity to endure to the limit. That idea was not only applied to the troops on the front, but also to the officers in the rear, who had to transmit that same logic to all levels, even when the conditions were unsustainable. Thus, hundreds of daily messages reached the surrounded units, with short phrases like "not one step back" or "hold out to the limit." The defeat at Stalingrad did not lead to a review of the strategy, but to the opposite. The command converted that failure into the justification to further harden the order to resist. Instead of analyzing the causes of the disaster, the idea was imposed that the only way out was always to endure, regardless of the cost. Since then, the orders were transmitted with an even more aggressive tone, where the essential thing was not to conserve forces or territory, but to demonstrate absolute obedience. This policy was maintained even when the enemy greatly outnumbered the German forces. Instead of adapting to the new scenario, the regime intensified its internal pressure, sending political commissars, improvised tribunals and special patrols tasked with curbing any sign of disobedience. The struggle shifted from the battlefield to the interior of the army itself, where many soldiers feared their superiors more than the enemy. The orders were communicated with harsh, unnuanced language, making it clear that whoever did not comply would be eliminated. The message was direct. Either you held your ground to the limit, or you disappeared under accusations of cowardice. In numerous sectors of the Eastern Front, especially in forested regions or valleys without operational relevance, German units were stationed for weeks without defined objectives. Although the terrain lacked strategic value, the orders required holding the position at all costs. Conditions worsened every day, but no movement was allowed. The retreat routes were blocked with snow, mud, or mines, and communications were cut off for entire days. Some detachments were abandoned without receiving reinforcements or supplies, isolated by decisions made far from the battlefield. When news reached the headquarters, it was already too late. The regiments had ceased to exist, swept away by enemy pressure or undone by attrition. That dynamic was repeated without exception, from the mountain passes of the Balkans to the frozen forests of the north, where time was running out without anyone questioning the orders. The accumulated attrition did not only affect the rank-and-file soldiers. The mid-level officers, who were the ones who had to execute those impossible orders, began to break down. Some tried to act with discretion, organizing covert retreats to save what was left of their units, but when they were discovered, they were immediately tried. They were not allowed to explain the situation or defend their decisions. The military tribunals worked quickly, issuing summary judgments and in many cases applying the maximum penalty in front of their own men to make clear what happened to those who disobeyed. Throughout the conflict, the idea of holding firm at any cost turned into a constant trap. Although the enemy forces advanced from all points, the orders were to continue defending localities with no tactical function. Soldiers received direct instructions not to abandon their positions, even when collapse was imminent. That mandate was also repeated in urban areas, where civilians were trapped with no way out. The situation of the population was not considered. The only thing that mattered was avoiding any mention of ceasing the fight. In the final stretch of the conflict, that logic became more violent. Units attempting to open corridors to evacuate the wounded or civilians were accused of treason. Many officers were executed for acting without permission, even when their actions sought to save lives. At the same time, special groups were created to monitor their own troops, with the task of reporting any attempt to retreat. That control became so strict that soldiers no longer knew whether to fear the enemy more or their own commanders. On many fronts, the collapse came not just from casualties, but from internal demoralization. Romania and Hungary, the allies that Berlin left to die. In the summer of 1942, while the German machinery was heading towards the River Don, the armies of Romania and Hungary received orders to occupy extensive sectors of the Eastern Front. The Berlin command placed them as a buffer between the bulk of the German forces and the Soviet lines, convinced that they could resist. The decision was not based on the actual capacity of those troops, but on the need to free up German divisions for the main offensive. Romanian soldiers were deployed to the south of Stalingrad, while the Hungarians occupied positions further to the north. From the start, the difference in armament, training, and morale was evident. But the order was clear. They had to hold the line as if they were units of the same level as the German divisions. The Romanians arrived at the front with deteriorated uniforms, obsolete weapons, and insufficient artillery. They did not have modern armored vehicles and barely had operational contact with the German Air Force. Despite this, the reports sent from Berlin asserted that they were in a position to fulfill their task. The Hungarians, with more troops, faced similar shortages. Their tanks could not compete with the Soviets, and the training of their troops was limited. The lack of means, added to a fragmented organization, left both armies in a precarious situation. Meanwhile, the German High Command redoubled its efforts in Stalingrad without reviewing the actual conditions on the flanks. What was supposed to serve as containment was reduced to a symbolic presence, poorly equipped and without support. During the first weeks, the Romanian and Hungarian lines remained stable thanks to the relative calm on the front. However, the Soviets were carefully watching those positions and waiting for the right moment to strike. In the Romanian camps, soldiers suffered from the lack of supplies, with scarce rations and insufficient winter equipment. Many covered themselves with improvised blankets while guarding poorly constructed trenches. Officers sent urgent requests for reinforcements and armament, but the responses took weeks to arrive, and when they did, they barely consisted of promises or minimal shipments. In parallel, the Hungarians received contradictory orders, having to hold overly extensive sectors with dispersed and poorly communicated units. In the autumn of that same year, the Soviet preparations intensified. The Stavka had decided that the Romanian and Hungarian lines would be the weak point through which to launch the counter-offensive that would encircle the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Meanwhile, the Germans remained occupied in the urban combat, paying no attention to the intelligence reports that warned of the danger on the flanks. The Romanian commanders insisted that their positions were unsustainable without armoured support, but in Berlin the response was emphatic. They had to resist. Hitler did not accept questioning and considered any attempt to retreat as an act of cowardice. Thus, the Axis divisions remained fixed on the ground, without the capacity for manoeuvre. On the 19th of November of 1942, the Soviets began Operation Uranus. In the early morning, a massive artillery preparation shook the Romanian trenches. In a matter of minutes, thousands of projectiles razed their positions, and the Soviet infantry advanced, followed by tank brigades. The Romanian defenders barely had anti-tank guns, many of them of insufficient caliber to penetrate the armour of the T-34s. The initial resistance collapsed in a matter of hours. Entire companies were destroyed without being able to respond, and communications were interrupted. The Soviet offensive expanded rapidly, and the Hungarian divisions, situated further north, were impacted soon after. Like their neighbours, they lacked modern weapons and were overrun with the same ease. In a matter of days, the Romanian and Hungarian lines collapsed. Thousands of soldiers attempted to retreat chaotically, while others were captured in masses. The German Sixth Army was surrounded in Stalingrad, precisely because the flanks had been held by Allied forces, incapable of resisting. Reports from the front recounted scenes of stampede, with entire columns of Romanians walking aimlessly, seeking to escape the Soviet encirclement. The German officers accused them of cowards, but in reality they had been sent on an impossible mission. With obsolete weapons and no reinforcements, their defeat was assured from the moment they were assigned that task. The abandonment of the Allies did not end at Stalingrad. In January of 1943, the Hungarian divisions deployed on the Don suffered a similar blow. The Red Army launched an offensive against their positions, and in a few days the Hungarians were destroyed. It is estimated that more than half of their contingent on the Eastern Front disappeared in a matter of weeks, killed, wounded, or prisoners. The magnitude of the losses was so great that the Hungarian army never recovered. Letters sent by the survivors narrated a panorama of abandonment, with soldiers without food, without ammunition, and without clear orders, resisting until they were annihilated. In Berlin, the news of the destruction of the Romanian and Hungarian armies was received coldly. For Hitler, these forces had only fulfilled their function of covering the flanks while the Germans attacked in Stalingrad. Their sacrifice was seen as a necessary price. There were no serious attempts to reinforce them before their collapse, nor to evacuate those who remained trapped. This indifference generated a deep resentment in Bucharest and Budapest, where the governments began to question their alliance with the Reich. However, for the troops who had been buried in the Russian steppe, those diplomatic tensions no longer meant anything. They had been sent to die in silence. The testimonies collected after the war confirmed the feeling of abandonment. Romanian soldiers recounted how they were promised air support that never arrived, and how they were ordered to hold the line until it was physically impossible. Hungarians described entire days fighting against tanks with ineffective rifles until their units completely dissolved. In both cases, the sensation was the same. They had been treated as cannon fodder to protect the German divisions. Neither their casualties nor their effort was recognized. In the official reports, their sacrifices barely occupied a few lines. The direct consequence of that policy was the irreversible deterioration of the relationship between Berlin and its allies. Starting in 1943, the governments of Romania and Hungary began to reassess their role within the Axis. The lack of support during the Soviet offensives, added to the useless sacrifice of their troops, was seen as a covert betrayal. In Bucharest and Budapest, the military and diplomatic leaderships began to explore discreet contacts with neutral powers, or even with the enemies of the Reich. The defeats on the Don and at Stalingrad not only meant a setback on the battlefield, but also a breaking point in strategic trust. Berlin had made it clear that its allies were expendable. From that moment, the commitment to the German war effort was weakened, and the possibility of breaking the alliance began to take shape within the circles of power. Russian winter, when the enemy was the climate. The advance toward Moscow seemed firm, but everything changed when autumn faded. As the mud froze, thousands of German soldiers discovered that the greatest obstacle was not the fighting, but the cold. There was no adequate preparation or sufficient warm clothing. Thick coats, wool hats, and lined boots were scarce, while the temperature dropped to levels unknown to those coming from the west. The engines stopped working, the oils hardened, the weapons jammed, and the men became motionless from the ice that got into their bones. On those open plains, the detachments were paralyzed without real refuge. They dug with frozen hands in the icy ground, attempting to make trenches where they spent the nights trembling. Some did not wake up. Casualties were no longer from crossfire or artillery, but from pneumonia, gangrenous feet, or bodies that simply gave up before a climate that did not forgive. In the Kalinin area, near the central front, units slept with their rifles under their bodies to prevent them from freezing. It was common for them to break when trying to fire. There was not enough fuel to keep vehicles running or to heat shelters. Some tried to build fires with smashed furniture from empty villages, but the smoke betrayed them. Every campfire could attract bombardments. So many chose to resist the cold without fire. The official reports did not recognize these deaths as killed in action. The High Command spoke of losses due to exhaustion or respiratory illnesses, although the soldiers knew they were dying from freezing. Rations arrived hard as stone. The bread had to be broken with the buttstock, and the stews turned into frozen blocks before reaching the trenches. Some kept the cans between their chest and shirt for hours just to be able to open them. In many sectors, the horses did not resist and died en masse. Some were devoured by the troops themselves. There was no alternative transport. The mules could not walk on ice. The wheels sank, the leather-soled boots hardened and slipped, the frost entered through the ankles. There were no spare parts. Soldiers used old rags, newspapers or skins stripped from fallen enemies. The mail stopped circulating. Letters did not arrive. There was no news from home. No one knew if their loved ones were still alive. The stoves did not work, and the generators collapsed. The radios turned off. Orders arrived late or did not arrive. The officers also began to disappear, swallowed by a snow that did not let up. In the Tula region, bodies of soldiers who had never reached the front were piling up. They died walking. Some fell face first into the snow and remained there, motionless, like statues. There were no ceremonies or burials. They froze so quickly that their eyes remained open. The snow gradually covered them. Patrols found corpses with grenades still strapped to their belts, hands on their rifles, backpacks closed. No one had time to pick them up. Those who remained standing avoided looking. They knew it would soon be their turn. The Russians, accustomed to the climate, advanced without stopping. They had suitable uniforms, thermal underwear, felt boots, double coats, and hats with ear flaps. They used skis and sleds. They knew when to move and when not to. Meanwhile, the Germans were isolated without support lines or cleared routes. The trucks could not cross the frozen roads. Convoys were organized but never arrived. Ambulances got stuck. The wounded died of cold before their injuries. Bandages adhered to the skin. Stretchers turned into blocks of ice. On the outskirts of Moscow, the makeshift shelters collapsed. There was not enough wood. Some used doors torn from destroyed houses. Others slept in caves dug under the snow. They took turns breathing the little warm air that remained inside. Hands turned black, ears fell off, fingers split. Screams were heard at dawn, when yet another person woke up without hands or feet. Doctors performed amputations without anesthesia. Using knives they first had to heat to cut. There were no antibiotics. Infections spread. The sick were abandoned. There were no stretchers, no mules, and no time. Some officers tried to organize tactical retreats, but the situation prevented it. The routes were blocked by the snow and the convoys never arrived. With the supply lines gone, all that remained were frozen trenches, soldiers without gloves, and enemies that did not stop advancing. In that winter, the German casualties surpassed the one expected, not due to offensives or encirclement, but because the climate, without firing a weapon, killed just like an attack. As the weeks went by, the groups became incommunicado. Some units spent days without contact with the general headquarters. Those who tried to return disappeared. Many died lost in the fog or frozen during the night march. The maps were outdated. There were no references. Everything was white. The ground could not be distinguished from the sky. Goggles fogged up. Compasses stopped working. Patrols did not return. The silence was total. Only steps crunching snow and the wind blowing ceaselessly could be heard. On the north flank, the divisions surrounding Leningrad suffered the same. Attempts to cut off the encirclement were interrupted by storms. The minefields were hidden. No one could advance without sinking. Grenades failed. Weapons fired by themselves when they got hot. Some kept the bullets under their arms to prevent them from splitting. Cannons bent, wheels cracked, steel creaked, the ice did not yield. Orders kept coming. Hold the position. Endure. Do not give up ground. But there was no one left to answer. Companies were almost empty. Reports were falsified. Figures were inflated. No one wanted to admit that an entire brigade had frozen. In the south, toward Rostov, the rivers froze and the bridges became useless. Attempts were made to cross on the ice, but many trucks sank while barges were trapped and boats broke. Engineers improvised walkways with logs that did not hold up. Those who were trapped in the water froze instantly. Some were seen still standing, frozen next to the rudder with no way to rescue them. Others tried to use the corpses as barriers against the wind, piling bodies around the camps. The living slept in the center and took turns breathing warm air. In those months, cemeteries disappeared because there was no time to dig. Bodies were lined up along the roads, sometimes marked with sticks, other times simply forgotten. Some were used as parapets when there were no more sandbags, and walls of bodies were built. Ammunition was scarce. They fired carefully. Grenades were counted one by one, and no one wasted a bullet. Everything was slow. No one ran. No one spoke. The climate dictated the pace. Inside the captured cities, the atmosphere was no better. The occupied houses were ruins without heating or water. The cisterns were frozen. There were no showers or toilets, and buckets were used and emptied outdoors. Feces froze. The smell disappeared, but the diseases did not. Epidemics appeared and spread among the soldiers who shared blankets. Skins stuck to uniforms, beards froze, eyebrows fell out, and skin cracked as the wind seeped through every seam. When spring arrived, it did so slowly. The snows melted and revealed hundreds of bodies. Some had been there for weeks, others for months. The mud returned, the roads became useless, but the climate was no longer deadly. The enemy was once again man. Even so, that winter left marks that would not be erased. No one spoke of it in speeches, but all those who survived knew it. It was the cold, not the bullets, that almost wiped them off the map. Deadly sieges, dying with no escape. When the German troops advanced toward Moscow in October of 1941, the Soviet command decided to halt their advance by deploying multiple reserve units to the Smolensk region, especially around Vyazma and Bryansk. What seemed like a multi-layered defensive maneuver quickly turned into a massive trap. Hitler had given absolute priority to the encirclement in that area, and the German commanders applied the same enveloping model that had already succeeded in Minsk and Kyiv. Army Group Center, reinforced with new armored vehicles, quickly closed the flanks. In just a few days, thousands of Soviet soldiers were trapped in an increasingly smaller space, without air cover, without reserves, and without access to stable supplies. The German High Command was confident that this maneuver would be decisive. The idea was to completely block the escape routes to the east before the Soviets could disorganize the encirclement. Meanwhile, the Red Army columns, surprised by the speed of the enemy movement, tried to regroup in the forest, where German artillery and aviation were already operating with total freedom. In the areas near Vyazma, Soviet units moved without coordination or clear leadership. To every attempt to break the siege, the German divisions responded with concentrated fire that broke up the columns on the march. Some groups ended up walking for days without finding safe routes, pursued by motorized patrols or by tactical bombings that exploded a few meters from the ground. The retreat became chaotic, and the encirclement ended up closing completely around more than 500,000 soldiers. In those conditions, the only way out was individual. It was no longer about holding the line or forming a stable defense, but about surviving however one could. The Soviet commanders in the area failed to establish a common strategy, and many officers became isolated along with small groups. The situation did not improve as the days passed. Communications were almost completely lost. Hunger began to weaken the battalions, and the nights were filled with screams, explosions, and stray shots that echoed among the trees. Some soldiers buried their weapons and crawled through the bushes to cross the German lines in the dark. Others surrendered in groups, raising white rags without knowing whether they would be heard or executed. The scene was repeated south and north of the encirclement, where German troops gathered prisoners en masse and forced them to walk in interminable columns to concentration points with barely any food or water. What happened at Vyazma was not just a defeat, it was a total tactical collapse. The German commanders reported that more than 300,000 soldiers had been captured, along with thousands of vehicles, cannons and documents. The fields were covered with wreckage, corpses and torn uniforms. The Red Army officers who managed to escape recounted that the retreat turned into absolute chaos. There were no maps, orders were contradictory, and the roads were blocked by destroyed vehicles. The lack of coordination turned the defense into an uncontrolled dissolution, where the commands failed to rally their men or establish fallback lines. Vyazma marked one of the highest points of German tactical dominance on the Eastern Front, but also the beginning of a new type of war, where encirclement was not an exception but a constant threat. That same pattern was repeated 2 years later, but under very different conditions. In January of 1944, the Red Army launched an offensive on the Korsun salient in central Ukraine, where several German divisions had held positions for months. Although the encirclement on this occasion was smaller, the impact was just as brutal. Stalin demanded immediate results, and the Soviet commanders designed an operation with 2 fronts that were to close on the city from the north and the south. The German units in the salient, surrounded by superior forces in number and with deteriorating logistics, were trapped at great speed. This time, the Wehrmacht had no room for maneuver. The muddy terrain, the winter rains, and the lack of fuel prevented any organized retreat. Vehicles got stuck in the mud, and the roads were impassable for the armored vehicles. The situation became critical in less than 1 week. The German officers at Korsun understood that there would be no immediate help from outside. Although an attempt was made to organize a breakthrough from the west, the Soviets blocked all access with heavy artillery and mines. Inside the encirclement, soldiers dug improvised trenches with shovels, bayonets, or even their hands. The snow soaked their coats, contaminated water caused diseases, and dead horses became food. Fighting took place at meters away, with machine guns hidden among the trees and snipers firing from invisible positions. Every escape attempt ended in an open field, where Soviet aviation swept the retreating groups. For days, reports spoke of entire columns disintegrated by enemy fire, with no possibility of retreating or holding their position. When a breakthrough was finally authorized, the German soldiers tried to make way in the night. They did so in loose groups, dragging the wounded, carrying ammunition on their backs, and crossing frozen streams in silence. The exit route was a narrow strip between 2 hills, covered in mud and guarded by enemy artillery. There, one of the most desperate scenes of the entire campaign occurred. Some managed to cross, others were trapped in the mud or fell under crossfire. Those who left the encirclement did so without weapons, without helmets, and without recognizable units. The Soviet offensive at Korsun was a devastating blow to German morale, not so much because of the number of casualties, but because of the evidence that they could no longer control the pace of the war. From that point, every encirclement became a real threat to any isolated unit. The siege ceased to be a Soviet strategy and became a daily possibility. What united Vyazma and Korsun was not only the physical confinement, but the certainty that there was no possible way out. In both cases, the trapped soldiers lived through days in which the only decision was how to fall, whether under enemy fire or under the cold without shelter. In that way of dying enclosed, the very notion of a front vanished. There was neither advance nor retreat, only a line of death that was slowly closing until it erased the entire map. Prisoners of the East, those who survived to die. From the very first days of the German attack against the Soviet Union, the soldiers who ended up in enemy hands knew they had little chance of seeing their country again. Many of those who were taken prisoner at the beginning were immediately shot, and in several areas of the Eastern Front, they did not even take the time to transfer them. However, with the passage of time and the increase in captures, the Soviet system began to organize its method of retaining, punishing, and exploiting these defeated men. The columns of prisoners advanced escorted by Soviet troops, where stragglers or those who collapsed were moved off the road, and in most cases simply eliminated without a word. Some were taken to makeshift camps near the front, where they remained for weeks without shelter until transport wagons were available, and others were forced to walk for days under surveillance, amidst shoves, shouts and threats. As the months passed, Moscow launched a much more structured system. Facilities were created in different regions of the interior, and officers were quickly separated from the rest. The German military hierarchy disappeared from the moment they were captured, and a simple non-commissioned officer could end up mixed with those who had commanded entire divisions. Classification was done in a hurry, based more on their appearance than on their actual function, and many tried to deceive the Soviets to avoid reprisals. Some burned their documents, others pretended to speak the language poorly, or mixed with other units to avoid being identified. Even so, the Red Army commissars usually acted harshly when they suspected something. Most of those captured ended up on trains bound for distant regions, and from there they were sent to labor camps where food was scarce. The cold pierced everything, and diseases spread unchecked. The system did not distinguish between conventional combatants and inexperienced recruits. From private soldiers to members of the medical or quartermaster staff, they were crammed into barracks where they barely fit, without adequate clothing and with food that failed to cover the minimum necessities. In winter, the death tolls rose non-stop, and in the camps of 1,942 alone, the number of daily fatalities reached over 300 in some sectors. Despite this, the Soviet authorities maintained the order to continue using them as labor in mines, factories, or reconstruction projects. Most prisoners had no idea how long they would be there, and very few even knew the war had ended when it did. They were frequently transferred, and many died before reaching their destination. During the last years of the conflict and the first years of the post-war period, interrogations became a regular part of the process. The Soviets sought information about the routes, commanders, and internal structure of the German units, and some men were tortured or threatened to speak. Others were simply isolated for days, without contact with anyone. Those who collaborated had a slight improvement in treatment, although it was not always enough to guarantee their lives. Those who refused or were considered suspicious could disappear from one day to the next. The Soviets also initiated a re-education process in several camps where collective sessions were organized to expose the crimes of the Nazi regime and justify the war as a necessary response. There, some soldiers began to show submission to their jailers for simple survival, while others were selected to form special groups intended to be repatriated in the future, albeit under strict conditions. With the end of the conflict, many of those in captivity thought they would be sent home shortly. However, the Soviets showed no intention of releasing them en masse. Thousands of them remained incarcerated for years, and not a few were transferred to other, even more remote locations, where camps surrounded by barbed wire with permanent surveillance and no external contact were maintained. Correspondence was controlled, and many relatives did not know that their sons, fathers or brothers were still alive until much later. In the archives of the Soviet penitentiary system, a significant part of the records were incomplete or directly falsified, which hindered any kind of tracking from the outside. Only a few humanitarian organizations were able to contact them, but their reports were partial, and they were almost never allowed to inspect the most remote camps. Between the 40s and the beginning of the 50s, the German captives continued to work forcibly under extreme conditions. Some were in the coal mines of Donbass, others were sent to construction projects in Siberia, and still others ended up opening roads or building military installations in areas that were previously forests. Diseases like dysentery, pneumonia, and typhus ravaged the weakest, and those who were unable to stand were usually segregated, without access to treatment or aid. Isolation, lack of news, and the passage of time broke the will of many. Some tried to escape, although those who were captured were not only punished with more years of labor, but were also humiliated before their comrades to set an example. In parallel, Moscow began to use certain prisoners as propaganda. Through special programs, they selected some soldiers to show the press as rehabilitated men, with clean uniforms and rehearsed statements. They were filmed working or receiving food, while Soviet officials talked about their good behavior. However, the majority remained far from any humane treatment. The largest groups, especially those without any technical skill, were trapped in a never-ending cycle where they moved from one camp to another without being released. In some cases, prisoners spent more than 8 years detained without having received any formal trial or having been accused of specific crimes. They were simply considered part of an enemy collective, and as such were held until it was deemed convenient to release them. When some countries began to negotiate repatriation agreements, the Soviet authorities were reluctant to release everyone. The process was slow, full of bureaucratic obstacles and political hurdles. Even when the first releases became effective, many of those returning did so with irreversible physical sequelae, with bones deformed by work, with tuberculosis, or with poorly healed injuries. Upon arrival on German territory, they faced an overwhelmed administrative apparatus, without updated records or clear protocols for reintegrating them. Some spent weeks in transit centers without receiving attention, and others were stranded without valid documents. The post-war system was not prepared to receive them, and many were referred to offices without resources, where they were treated as a residual problem of a war that everyone wanted to forget. For them, liberation was not a return home, but the beginning of a new limbo. For years, the reports on the real conditions of these prisoners remained hidden, and many names never appeared on the lists of survivors. Only after the fall of the Soviet bloc were some archives opened, and the fate of thousands of men who had been presumed dead could be traced. Among them, there were cases of soldiers who never set foot in a court, who never had an individual cell or an assigned officer, and who simply disappeared within the gears of a system where collective punishment was more important than any formal process. Thus ended the road for those who did not die in combat, but who also failed to return as free men, dying believing how propaganda led to the slaughterhouse. While the German troops began to suffer setbacks, the voice of power showed no cracks. Goebbels, from his tribune, intensified the messages of unity and sacrifice. Through the radio, the newsreels, and the posters that filled the streets, it was ceaselessly repeated that the enemy was not just any army, but an existential threat that would destroy everything if it managed to advance. That vision left no room for doubt. Under that framework, any attempt at questioning was censored, and those who showed signs of discouragement were branded as cowards, or worse yet, as traitors. The phrases were direct, crude, and unambiguous. It was not about winning a war, it was about saving the essence of the country, and to achieve this, the commitment had to be total. Thus, while the fronts collapsed, the rhetoric did not yield an inch. Instead of preparing the population for the collapse, they were pushed to continue believing that salvation would come, even when there were no forces or ammunition left. As the defeats accumulated, the content of the official messages changed in tone, but not in objective. They no longer spoke of advances or conquests, but of heroic resistance, of the need to stand firm as the enemy approached the cities. Newspapers stopped showing maps and began to highlight examples of soldiers who preferred to die rather than retreat. Stories were exalted of young men who immolated themselves with grenades to stop an enemy column, or of women who gave up their homes to turn them into a defense point. None of that was verified, but it was not necessary either. The function was not to inform, it was to harden the spirit. Even when everything indicated that the conflict was lost, the official communiques insisted that victory was still possible, and whoever thought otherwise was helping the enemy from within. The obsession with controlling thought reached extreme levels when the regime declared that any attempt to question the Führer's orders was equivalent to sabotage. It was no longer enough to obey. Now it was necessary to demonstrate enthusiasm. The letters arriving at the front were reviewed, public comments were monitored, and expressions of skepticism could cost one's life. Many soldiers, aware of the real situation, chose to remain silent, while others, more influenced by the propaganda, insisted that surrender was a defeatist fantasy. This internal fracture did not prevent everyone from marching in the same direction. The pressure did not only come from above, it also came from comrades who did not tolerate doubts. Thus, even those who no longer believed ended up behaving as if they did, dragged by fear and the certainty that they had no escape. In the last months of the conflict, when the fronts collapsed and chaos took over the cities, the apparatus of persuasion became more insistent. There was no longer talk of possible strategic turns or miraculous alliances. Now the message was clear. They had to fight until the last moment, even if it meant dying senselessly. Pamphlets were distributed asserting that the Führer had a secret plan, that at any moment an unstoppable counter-offensive would be unleashed. None of that happened, but that illusion kept many at their posts, convinced that their role was to hold on just a little longer. Meanwhile, the military chiefs knew that there was nothing behind those words, only the need to continue pretending to be in control while everything crumbled. The use of children and the elderly in the defense of the cities was one of the most extreme consequences of that logic. Instead of evacuating, they were handed a weapon and told that their contribution was decisive. Inexperienced young people were sent to the front with promises of glory, knowing that they would be shot down in minutes. Even so, many accepted that mission with pride, not out of conviction, but because everything around them had made them believe that valor was measured in resistance, not in survival. That thinking was the direct result of years of speeches, heroic films, and songs that spoke of eternity. By the time they understood the truth, it was too late. At that point, even those who began to doubt continued to act as believers. Inertia was stronger than reason. In the capital, when the roar of the fighting was already heard a few meters away, the loudspeakers continued broadcasting messages of encouragement. They spoke of fidelity, absolute dedication, and historical examples that justified martyrdom. Episodes from other wars were recalled, where firmness had saved peoples. The intention was not to inform, but to prevent psychological collapse. While the buildings fell and civilians ran looking for shelter, the official voice continued to repeat that everything depended on the will of the people. That insistence could not stop the enemy's advance, but it managed to maintain obedience. Many of those who fought in the streets did so without knowing why, only because someone had told them that this was the only option. That blind obedience, that faith constructed on the basis of slogans, was the regime's last resort. In remote areas, far from the command centers, the panorama was no different. Local offices, without precise instructions, continued to replicate the regime's communiques. The inhabitants tried to organize to build defenses or hide supplies without knowing if it was of any use. Most did not understand the magnitude of the collapse, but they continued to act as if there was still a chance. Even without having anything, they continued to use the expressions they had been hearing for years. They did not do it out of loyalty, but out of habit. In an environment where misinformation had supplanted reality, all that remained was to repeat what had always been said. When there was no hope left, the messages became even more emphatic. They spoke of the legacy, of the people, of resisting out of pride. It was affirmed that even if everything ended, the spirit would not be extinguished. Those speeches no longer aroused enthusiasm, but neither were they refuted. Some died convinced that they were part of an eternal cause. Others knew it was not true, but saw no other option. In both cases, the propaganda had achieved its goal. It did not consist of achieving victory, but of getting everyone to fall thinking that it was still worth fighting. Berlin in the end, the trap with no return. When the Soviet troops began to encircle the German capital, the city no longer offered any way out. Orders arriving from the highest levels insisted on resisting at any price, even though the enemy was already crossing the parks, the subway tunnels, the canals, and the suburban streets. In that environment, adolescents barely 15 years old and elderly people taken from archives, factories and offices were mobilized, while officers with no future toured the neighborhoods to distribute weapons with instructions to stand firm until the limit. Despite the Red Army's uninterrupted advance and the disorder reigning even in the senior command, decrees signed in the Führer's name continued to appear, demanding that every block, every intersection and every building be held. The makeshift soldiers dug trenches in the middle of the avenues and hid behind collapsed columns or abandoned wagons, while the bombings offered no respite and the enemy tanks approached relentlessly. Precisely then, those who still obeyed orders found themselves surrounded by a population that no longer understood the purpose of continuing to fight, but that also had no real alternative. While that was happening on the surface, thousands of people took refuge underground, where air was scarce and fear multiplied with every explosion. The subway stations became silent waiting camps, with entire families lying next to iron columns, elderly people sitting on stopped escalators, and children crying without understanding what was happening. Some wounded were also installed there, brought on improvised stretchers, without medicine or doctors, attended only by volunteers who did not know if the city would still be standing when they left. On the surface, the fighting did not distinguish between organized units and loose groups, where young people with armbands and training rifles faced experienced Soviet soldiers who no longer offered mercy. Every neighborhood was the scene of shootings, ambushes, fires, and collapses. Some buildings burned for days, and the columns of smoke constantly darkened the sky. Among the debris, swastika flags were still raised, although their presence no longer intimidated anyone. The officers who remained transmitted communiques promising reinforcements that would never arrive and held maps that no longer corresponded to the reality of the streets. In that scenario, the regular divisions were replaced by groups without fixed hierarchy, where everyone knew that only hours remained. The underground command center continued to send messages demanding that discipline be maintained, but outside those walls, the war no longer answered to any formal structure. At several points in the city, columns of children and adolescents formed, marching in uniforms that were too large, some with helmets from other conflicts, others with simple hand-painted armbands. They received basic instructions and limited ammunition, but they were assigned the task of protecting streets where enemy armored vehicles were advancing. Many failed to fire even one shot before being hit by the first projectiles, and those who survived returned without direction or solace. Even so, the local authorities insisted that every young person should give their life for the capital, and impromptu meetings were held where worn-out slogans were repeated as the noise of the explosions drew closer. In the closed schools, where geography or biology classes were once held, now unlabeled weapons, backpacks with dirty bandages, and posters with hand-to-hand combat instructions were accumulated. School cafeteria kitchens were used to prepare food with rationed ingredients, and the hallways served as makeshift shelters where an attempt was made to maintain some normality amidst the irreversible. As the days passed, the neighborhoods were left without electricity, running water, or fresh food. The authorities ordered the destruction of bridges, the closing of tunnels, and the blocking of access points, with the idea of slowing the enemy's advance, although in practice this also prevented the citizens themselves from escaping. The sirens continued to sound at increasingly shorter intervals, and the nights were filled with screams, gunfire, and buildings collapsing one after another. In the last days of April, the city was already divided into fragments without connection to one another. In each of them, small armed groups resisted as best they could, without knowing what was happening in the rest of the map. Some combatants believed that the Führer had abandoned the city, others that he was still in his bunker giving orders, although no one could confirm anything anymore. Leaflets were distributed that spoke of a counter-offensive that never materialized, and the radios repeated recorded speeches that talked about sacrifice, while everything outside was falling apart. Corpses piled up on the corners, and no one could bury them. Trucks no longer circulated, and ambulances were hit by projectiles before reaching their destination. Churches, theaters, and luxury hotels were converted into fortresses, trenches, or simple ruins. Amidst this collapse, any attempt to coordinate a retreat hung in the air, with no communication channels or operational hierarchies. Some local commands sought exits on their own, but lacked information and logistical support. Precisely then, the Soviet troops crossed the main central bridges and surrounded the administrative heart, where the last commanders still believed they could stop the inevitable. The main bunker, hidden underground, functioned as a refuge disconnected from reality, where war reports that no one read anymore were drafted. Decorations were still assigned and appointments were signed, while outside there were no functional military structures left. In that same environment, some high-ranking officers ordered suicidal exits through narrow tunnels or destroyed routes, with the idea of breaking through the enemy encirclement and reaching regions where there were still Allied troops. Very few succeeded. Most were captured or shot down before crossing the first perimeter. At the same time, inside the bunker, the last defenders discussed escape routes while the detonations were heard closer and closer. At other points in the city, small groups of civilians sought white flags and approached the Soviet units in the hope of saving themselves, although many times they were met with suspicion or directly ignored. Hospitals continued to operate with remnant personnel, but without medicines or energy. The wards were full of seriously wounded people who could not be evacuated. Some doctors used oil lamps to operate and moved patients between rubble, while outside the shots did not stop. Orders continued to arrive by radio, often without a recipient, and the devices continued to transmit instructions for units that no longer existed. When the Soviet troops finally occupied the city center, they did so amidst smoking ruins, scattered bodies, and walls full of slogans that no longer meant anything. Thus ended the siege of Berlin, without a parade, without a clear announcement, and with no return. Wounded, suicides, and trauma, the other side of the 90%. Beginning in 1943, thousands of German soldiers began returning from the front, their eyes lost and their bodies destroyed. Some arrived on stretchers, covered in bandages. Others sat silently, bearing invisible scars. On the trains arriving from the east, many of those who got off could not explain what they had experienced, while others could barely stand. At stations like those in East Prussia or Saxony, the carriages unloaded young men without legs, men with blindfolds, or their faces covered in gauze that barely concealed the broken flesh. As the fighting intensified relentlessly and the bombings razed entire cities, the field hospitals were overwhelmed, and those who survived were forever scarred. In places like Königsberg or Breslau, the makeshift operating rooms never stopped. The amputations were swift, without sufficient anesthesia, with surgeons working amid screams, pools of blood and bodies trembling in pain. In those same corridors, some men murmured the names of comrades who hadn't made it back, while others were unable to utter a word and just covered their heads with their hands. Meanwhile, in the units that were still resisting on the most battered fronts, stories began to emerge about soldiers who wandered away without permission and did not return. In some regiments, these acts were punished immediately. The officers offered no explanation. A small platoon was assembled, a hole was dug, and shortly after, the deserter was buried without ceremony. In Ukraine, in the northern forests or in the ruins of cities reduced to rubble, scenes of this type were repeated without anyone protesting. The fear of being accused of cowardice kept many at their posts, even when there was no longer any hope of victory. At certain points on the front, the commands received clear orders. Do not tolerate doubts or flights, even if that meant shooting at their own men. Thus, the punishment for abandoning the line was not an exception, but an accepted and repeated practice regardless of the age or condition of the person involved. In that same period, worrying reports began to reach the offices of the High Command. A growing number of casualties did not correspond to direct combat or visible wounds. There were men found alone in empty tents or behind abandoned lines. They showed no signs of recent engagement, but they were dead. On several occasions, the cause was a badly handled grenade or an apparently accidental shot. However, those in charge of writing the reports knew that many of these deaths were not due to chance or the enemy. In the war diaries, officers wrote down ambiguous phrases such as "fell due to extreme exhaustion" or "could not withstand the pressure of combat." In reality, these were soldiers who, seeing that all was lost, made a decision from which there was no turning back. They did it in silence, away from the others, sometimes after writing a brief note, other times leaving no explanation. Some wrapped themselves in their blanket, sat next to an empty trench, and pulled the trigger, pointing toward themselves. The real figures were never published. No one spoke about it out loud. In recovery centers located near the Alps or on the outskirts of Berlin, doctors treated men who couldn't sleep, who woke up screaming, or who couldn't stand the sound of a door slamming. These soldiers were no longer useful to the front, but they couldn't return home either. Many were kept in locked rooms with reinforced windows under constant guard. In some cases, they tried to escape. In others, they refused to eat or spent hours staring at a wall. Those in charge of these centers knew the situation was worsening, but they were ordered to keep everything discreet. The system didn't allow for weakness, much less for acknowledging that thousands of their own men were being destroyed from within. In the final stretch of the war, when chaos ruled the streets of the occupied cities and the enemy advanced unchecked, the most depleted units began to lose control. Professional soldiers, forcibly recruited teenagers, and inexperienced officers who no longer knew whom to obey were all mixed together. In this environment, desertion cases increased, but so did swift executions and exemplary punishments. Often those who could barely hold a rifle were forced to participate in the platoons that carried out these sentences. The fear of suffering the same fate ensured silence. Even in Berlin, in the final days, this logic continued. While gunshots echoed in every corner, bodies continued to appear in courtyards, dark stairwells, or underground tunnels. No one asked about them. Everyone knew there were more ways to die than in combat. The women in charge of attending to the wounded, both in makeshift hospitals and on hospital trains, also began to notice changes. Some soldiers refused to receive care, rejected bandages, or smashed bottles of medicine. Sometimes they hid the ammunition they had left, other times they disappeared during the night without a trace. The nurses recorded strange behaviors, but they did not know who to report them to. The medical command merely indicated that these were psychiatric cases without providing further detail. In reality, they were men completely overcome by fear, pain, or guilt, who could no longer distinguish between day and night. Many of them had not been physically wounded, but they could not return home. They had seen too much, lost everyone they knew, and now walked like aimless shadows. There were also cases where junior officers decided to act on their own. In certain divisions, especially those that were isolated, the toughest captains ordered the execution of anyone who showed signs of weakness. It was enough for someone to say they did not want to continue or to mention their family to be accused of desertion. In the forests of Hungary, in the frozen fields of Pomerania, and in the last positions of the Oder, those decisions were repeated. The platoons in charge of carrying them out followed orders without hesitation. They shot, covered the body with earth, and returned to their posts. Then the command wrote on the report that the soldier fell during a retreat. Thus, control was maintained, even if it was over corpses. In parallel, requests for transfer to medical units increased, but most were rejected. Priority was given to the seriously wounded, and those requesting psychological attention were viewed with suspicion. It was even said that some did this to avoid combat, which only worsened their situation. Thus many remained in their positions until they collapsed. Some were found motionless, unresponsive to stimuli, with an empty gaze. Others were interned by order of their superiors, who did not know what to do with them. They were no longer soldiers, but not civilians either. They became bodies present yet absent, who could not be useful even for minor tasks. When the war came to its end, many of those who survived did not return to their towns. They were lost in destroyed cities, in hospitals without records, or were buried as unknowns. Families never received clear answers. Some received letters with neutral phrases, stating that their son or husband had fallen in the line of duty. In reality, many had disappeared in abandoned trenches, in collapsed buildings, or in silent wards where no one asked about them anymore. They were the invisible victims of a system that pushed them to the limit and left no space for return. This group, who did not die from enemy bullets nor from bombardments, ended up being part of the same number. They were counted among the fallen, but their story was left out of the official reports. They were never honored. No one read their names aloud, nor placed flowers on their graves. They were men who, seeing no way out, chose one that was not written in the regulations.